My name is Lena Carter, and I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving I wasn't allowed to come home for. Not because I did anything wrong. Not because I had a falling out with anyone in my family. Not because I was too busy or sick or had any reasonable excuse that might make sense of it. I was removed from my own family's table, the table I had sat at every holiday for 26 years, from the time I was small enough to need a booster seat with a bib tucked around my neck, all the way to the years I showed up as an adult carrying wine and homemade pie, simply because a man I had met exactly twice in my life felt uncomfortable with my presence. And the most painful part of this whole story isn't that man. It isn't the feeling of rejection, of being pushed out into the cold while everyone gathered inside. The most painful part is what happened before any of that, the brief, hesitant silences on the phone when I asked my mother what Dad thought, what Marcus thought, whether Sophie even knew. And in every answer, in every half-second of uncomfortable quiet, I understood something. Not one person in my family, not a single one, had spoken up for me. They just agreed. Cleanly, easily, and quickly, the way you cross a name off a guest list. But this isn't only a story about my heartbreak. Even though that heartbreak was real and deep, and I won't pretend otherwise. This is the story of what happened on the Monday morning after Thanksgiving. When Daniel Brooks, Sophie's new husband, the man who had stepped into my family and within 3 months, managed to convince everyone in it to show me the door, walked straight into my office with a face the color of printer paper, eyes wide in the way of someone who has just seen a ghost, and the slow, agonizing, unavoidable realization that everything he had worked to control had been slipping through his fingers for a long time already. The ghost he saw that morning was me. To understand this story, you need to understand who I am first. I'm Lena Carter, 26 years old, Director of Compliance at Meridian Financial Group, one of the most respected financial institutions in the city. I earned that title at 24, younger than anyone in the company's history, and not because I was lucky or well-connected or particularly blessed by the universe. It's because from the age of 15, when most of my friends were focused on homework and weekend parties, I was sitting beside my father reading financial reports and asking why the numbers didn't line up. I ask questions. Everyone who knows me says so, and depending on who's doing the saying, it means something different. To my boss, the CEO James Whitmore, it means I'm the person he calls when an investigation is hard and the answers are buried deep. To my friends, it means I'm the one they phone at midnight when they need someone to help them think through a complicated problem. To my family, to my mother especially, it means I don't know when to stop, and I have a tendency to make people feel like they're being cross-examined. That was the language my mother used. Cross-examined. As though a question is a form of aggression, not a way people connect with each other. I remember the day I got the call that changed everything. It was a Wednesday, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Outside, rain was falling the way November rain does in the Northeast. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady, cold, stubborn drizzle that keeps going without commitment, as if the sky can't quite decide what it wants. I was at my desk with 3 monitors open, spreadsheets and financial reports stacked across all of them, and a cup of coffee I'd poured at 10 in the morning that had long since gone cold. My mother's number appeared on my phone screen. I smiled, set down my pen, stretched my shoulders because I'd been sitting too long, and answered with the most cheerful voice I could manage at 3 in the afternoon on a busy workday. Mom, I'm trying to decide whether to make the pumpkin pie from scratch, or just buy one. Last year the crust burned a little, but I think I've figured out what I did wrong. I found this new recipe that, Lena, just that, one word, and in that single syllable I already knew. My mother has the voice of a woman who learned decades ago that bad news is best delivered quickly, calmly, without leaving any room for the other person to react before the whole sentence is already out. When she said my name in that tone, not the voice she uses to call me to dinner, but the voice she uses to deliver news, I understood immediately that this conversation was not going where I thought. This Thanksgiving. She paused for exactly 1 beat, just long enough for me to feel the weight of what was coming. Daniel feels it would be better if you didn't attend. I went still. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Outside the window, the rain kept falling. A car pulled over below, its turn signal blinking amber in the gray afternoon light. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said finally, my voice strange to my own ears, calm in a way that didn't quite belong to me. "I didn't catch that. Can you say it again?" "Daniel." My mother repeated his name as though it were a complete explanation. "Sophie's husband. You've met him. He told Sophie he feels uncomfortable with you there. That you would." She hesitated. "He said you would ruin the atmosphere." Ruin the atmosphere. I turned the phrase over in my mind once, twice, tried to understand what it meant taken literally, and tried to understand why my mother was saying it in the voice of someone passing along information rather than someone who was pushing back or defending me. "Mom," I said, and my voice was still unervingly calm, "Daniel has met me twice. Once at the family dinner in July when Sophie introduced him. Once at their wedding in September. I've spoken to him directly for maybe 45 minutes total in my entire life. What did I do to make him that uncomfortable?" "Lena, you know how you are." My mother's voice had the quality of practiced patience, the tone she uses when she already knows the answer won't be accepted and she's bracing for the resistance. "You ask too many questions. You analyze everything. You make people feel like they're being interrogated. How you are. As though curiosity, the desire to understand, asking questions of a new person in the family because you want to know them, as though all of that is a character defect you should apologize for carrying." "Mom, at that July dinner, I asked him about his work because I wanted to get to know him. Sophie had just introduced him as the man she loved. I asked so I could understand who he was. That's just normal, isn't it? When you meet someone new in the family. You asked a lot of questions about his company specifically." "He said he works in financial advising. I work in finance. I thought we had something in common. I thought that was a good thing to talk about." "Lena." My mother sighed, that long sigh I've heard hundreds of times in my life. The sigh of someone who has already made up her mind and is tired of a conversation she knows exactly how to predict. "Your father and I talked it over. Sophie and Daniel have only been married 3 months. This is their first Thanksgiving as husband and wife. I want Daniel to feel welcomed, to feel like he's a part of this family." I sat quietly for another moment, looked out the window. The rain kept falling. "And I'm not welcome?" I asked softly. Silence. Not the silence of someone forming an answer. The silence of someone who doesn't have a good one. "Mom." I felt my voice crack just slightly at the end of that word. A small fracture, just one, but I heard it and I was certain my mother heard it too. I didn't want that. I didn't want them to hear that I was hurt, didn't want to become the person who cries and begs and makes a scene. But sometimes the body betrays you. I am your daughter. I have sat at that Thanksgiving table since I was 2 years old. 24 years at that table. You're telling me that because a man I've met twice in my life feels uncomfortable, I have to spend the holiday alone. Just this year, Lena. Until things settle. Just this year. As though the word just makes it more bearable. As though putting a time limit on an exclusion makes the exclusion itself less real. "Does Dad know?" I asked even though I already knew the answer. "Dad agrees with me." "What about Marcus?" "My brother. 31 years old. The person I had spent years believing would be the one to say something's not right here when it mattered." My mother was quiet for a beat too long. "Marcus thinks it's better to avoid conflict in the family." So there was no one. My father, who had taught me how to read a balance sheet at 15, who had encouraged me to study financial law because he said you have a mind built for justice, he agreed. My mother, who had sat beside my bed every time I was sick as a child, who knew I take my coffee black and that I'm afraid of spiders and that I cry at sad movies even though I never admit it, she agreed. Marcus, the older brother I used to sneak into his room to ask for help with hard math problems, he had chosen not to make it an issue. And Sophie, my sister, the one I'd brought flowers to on her graduation day, the one I'd sat up all night with when her last boyfriend broke her heart, she had allowed her husband to decide that her sister didn't belong at the family table. Not one of them said, "This isn't right." Not one asked, "Why exactly?" Not one picked up the phone to call me and say, "Lena, do you want to talk about this?" They just agreed. Tidily, quickly, and without apparent difficulty, as though I were a line item they could strike through without any real cost. "Okay," I said. My voice was completely flat now. I had reeled it in, locked it down, placed it in a box and sealed it shut. This is the skill I had spent 10 years developing inside corporate environments, the ability to keep my face and voice from betraying what was happening underneath. "I understand. I won't be there." "Lena, don't be like that." "I'm not being like anything, Mom. I'm just saying I understand. Have a nice Thanksgiving." I hung up before she could say anything else. Then I sat staring at my computer screen for 15 minutes without seeing a single thing on it. To give this story its full meaning, you need to know a little more about the Carters. We're not a dysfunctional family in the way TV dramas portray. No violence, no gambling or drinking, no dark secret lurking behind a closed door. We're a normal family in the way that normal families sometimes have their own particular set of problems. My parents have been married 30 years. They go to church on Sundays. They have a house in the suburbs with a garden in the front. They sit down to dinner together regularly. And within that family, there has existed for as long as I can remember an unofficial but very real division. Sophie is the easy one to love, and Lena is the difficult one. Sophie is older, 4 years ahead of me. Pretty in the way that people describe as gentle, soft brown hair. An always ready smile. A way of talking that makes everyone around her feel at ease immediately. Sophie studied marketing, graduated and went to work at an events company, has a wide circle of friends, and has never once questioned the decisions adults in the family present as already settled. I was different. I studied finance and law, graduated with the highest distinction in my program, and from the time I was small I was the child who asked why often enough that my 4th grade teacher wrote in my semester report. Lena is an exceptional student but would benefit from learning to listen rather than always asking questions. My mother clipped that note and kept it in a drawer. I was never sure whether it was to remind me, or to remind herself. It's not that my family and I don't love each other. We do. That's exactly what makes everything complicated. It would be so much simpler if this were the story of a cold or cruel family. But it isn't. This is the story of a family that loves each other in the way they learn to, and that way didn't always make space for me as I actually am. They loved the version of me that was easiest for them to be around. Lena when she sits quietly and smiles. Not Lena when she asks why. And Daniel Brooks read that. He read it quickly, accurately, and he used it. In the 12 days between my mother's phone call and Thanksgiving, I didn't call anyone in my family back. Not because I was so furious I couldn't communicate. Not because I was building toward a dramatic confrontation. But because I didn't know what to say. What had happened wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. There was no wrong information to correct. Everyone knew exactly what had happened, and everyone had chosen their position. Talking more would only mean hearing the same answers with more words. So I kept going. That's what I do best. Move forward when everything inside is quietly falling apart. It isn't exactly a virtue, but it's the survival skill I've developed over many years, and in those 12 days it served me adequately. I arrived at the office at 8 every morning. I worked until 7 or 8 at night. I drank coffee and read documents and sat through meetings and answered email. I went to the gym at 6 in the morning because that's the only method I've found for clearing my head. When your body is focused on not collapsing, your brain doesn't have much bandwidth left for everything else. That fall, I was leading the largest investigation of my career, and that work was the only thing that felt solid in those weeks. I'm a compliance director. People often ask what that means in practice because the title sounds abstract. I usually explain it this way. Imagine you've been hired to find a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is millions of financial transactions, and the needle is fraud, carefully disguised through layers of corporate entities, shell accounts, and legal language engineered to obscure its real meaning. My job is to ask questions, find the inconsistencies, and pull on that thread until the whole tapestry unravels. The irony isn't small. Asking questions is what makes people uncomfortable in my family, and it's also the single reason I'm compensated as well as I am. For 6 months, my team had been following a complex financial fraud scheme involving an investment advisory firm in the city. The firm was advising individual clients, most of them retirees, middle-class families, people saving for their children's college education, and recommending that they invest in certain funds. What those clients were never told was that the advisory firm was receiving undisclosed kickbacks from those very funds, millions of dollars each year. Not disclosed, not documented anywhere a client could access or read. Clear violation of fiduciary duty. Violation of SEC regulations. And with the materials we'd gathered, internal emails, transaction records, confidential agreements, this was financial fraud that could be prosecuted criminally. The week before Thanksgiving, we officially identified the company by name. We had enough evidence. We were preparing the file to submit to the SEC and refer to the Department of Justice. The company's name was Apex Advisory Partners. And I didn't know, had no reason to know at that point, that Daniel Brooks, Sophie's new husband, was a senior financial advisor at Apex Advisory Partners. In those 12 days, I also did this. I lay awake after 11 most nights and let my thoughts move through me. Not deep, structured thinking. Just letting them pass like clouds. Not trying to hold them. Not trying to push them away. Just watching them arrive and go. I thought about the Thanksgiving table. The big oak one my father bought before I was born. The table that had absorbed 26 years of the Carter family's holidays. I remembered its smell, turkey and chestnuts and toasted bread and candle wax. A smell that even now, when I think of it, brings a reflexive warmth before my brain catches up and reminds me that this year I won't be sitting there. I thought about previous years. The year I was 20 and brought a boyfriend home for the first time, and my father spent an hour over dinner asking him about his future plans. The year I was 22, when I just gotten my first job at Meridian and my mother made a whole pot of chicken soup to celebrate and said, "I'm proud of you." The year I was 24, when I was promoted to director, and my father looked at me across the table with an expression I have no word for other than proud. That was my family too. That was also real. The truth is complicated in that way. The same family can love you and still fail to protect you. The same person can be proud of you and still easily set you aside when someone else makes a demand. That's not a contradiction. It's just what people are. We're inconsistent. We fear conflict. We tend to take the path of least friction even when that path has a cost. I understood that intellectually. Understanding it emotionally is a different matter entirely. Thanksgiving morning I got up at 7. Not because I'd slept well and woke up naturally, but because after 5 in the morning I couldn't sleep anymore, and lying in bed staring at the ceiling until 7 seemed pointless. I made coffee, not a cup but a full pot, because that day I needed the whole pot. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the street below. The city had that particular silence of a holiday morning. Sparse traffic, almost no one walking, storefronts closed with their shutters drawn. Everyone was somewhere, inside someone's house, making food or sleeping in or sitting at a table with their family. Only I was standing at the window with a pot of coffee. I didn't let myself sink into that feeling. Instead, I made the most substantial breakfast I could think of. Scrambled eggs with cheese, mushrooms sautéed in butter and garlic, toast with avocado and tomatoes. I don't like eating alone, but I also knew that sitting with only a coffee and nothing else would let my mind go to places I didn't want to go that day. I ate slowly and deliberately, listened to a podcast about Roman history, a subject with no connection to anything in my life, which was precisely the appeal. In the afternoon I walked in the park near my apartment. An hour. I wore earbuds but played nothing through them, just wanting something in my ears to take the edge off, feeling completely alone. The November wind cut through my coat and turned my cheeks pink, and I walked without thinking much, just placing one foot after the other, watching the bare trees and the pale gray sky. In the evening I ordered Thai food, pad see ew and tom kha and spring rolls because that day called for generosity in eating, and sat on my couch with the warm bowl in my hands watching a documentary about the biggest financial fraud cases in history. Some people unwind with comedies or romantic films. I unwind with white-collar crime documentaries. I don't see what's unusual about that. When I went to bed around 11, I lay in the dark and told myself, okay, I got through today. Still here. Not broken. Tomorrow work as normal. I had no idea that normal was the completely wrong word for what was waiting for me the next morning. The Meridian Financial Group offices were quieter than usual the Monday after Thanksgiving. Many people had taken the extra day off to extend the holiday. A common practice I never fully understood but didn't judge. I'm not someone who needs holidays on schedule. I need things to do, and arriving at the office at 8 in the morning when the whole floor is empty and no one interrupts you is something I genuinely enjoy. I made coffee from the small espresso machine on my desk, a birthday present I gave myself 3 years ago, one of the best purchasing decisions of my life. Opened my laptop, went through my email, pulled up the Apex investigation file. There was a 10 o'clock meeting with the legal team about the timeline for filing. 3 calls to return. A stack of documents to review one final time before they went into the executive summary. This was normal. This was what felt solid. Around 9, Priya, the floor's receptionist, 6 months into the role, who had a habit of knocking with exactly the right amount of force, not too hard and not too soft, which I found oddly comforting, leaned into my doorway. Miss Carter, there's a man at the front desk who says his name is Daniel Brooks. He says he knows you personally and doesn't have an appointment. Would you like to see him? I looked up from my screen. Daniel Brooks. The name did something strange in my brain, like 2 electrical currents meeting. One was Sophie's husband, the man who had me uninvited from Thanksgiving. The other was, why on earth is he here? No combination of those 2 things produced a sentence that made sense. Send him in, I said. Priya nodded and disappeared, pulling the door closed gently behind her. I shut my laptop, placed both hands flat on the desk in the way I do before important meetings. Palms down, shoulders relaxed, spine straight. The posture of someone who isn't caught off guard, even when in fact she is. And I waited. Daniel Brooks walked into my office 30 seconds later. I recognized him immediately, tall, brown hair, the angular face of someone people routinely describe as trustworthy looking, the kind of face that financial advising clients tend to believe. At Sophie's wedding, he'd worn a white suit and had the open, practiced smile of someone accustomed to working a room. Today he was in gray slacks and a pale blue dress shirt without a tie, looking like someone who had left the house in a hurry without paying attention to himself. But what I noticed first wasn't his clothes. It was his face. I've seen a lot of faces in my career. The face of someone who knows they're being investigated, the face of someone about to confess, the face of someone who has just realized the exit they've been looking for doesn't exist. There are expressions that 10 years of this work teaches you to read like print. The expression on Daniel Brooks's face when he walked into my office was the expression of a man who has just seen a ghost. He stopped right at the threshold. His eyes moved to me, then around the office, the shelves of case files, the whiteboard covered in diagrams and arrows, and one company name written in red marker. The nameplate on my desk that read clearly Lena Carter, Director of Compliance, then back to me. His color changed in about 2 seconds, from the flushed pink of someone who'd just come in from the cold, down to the white of someone whose blood had drained from their face, almost literally. Lena, he said. His voice was rough, like someone who hadn't spoken yet that morning. You work here. Not a question. Not a greeting. The statement of a person who has just processed something they can't manage in the first few seconds of understanding it. Yes, I said, my voice as level as still water. I've worked here for 4 years. What can I do for you, Daniel? He was still standing in the doorway. I gestured to the chair in front of my desk. Sit down. He sat. The way he lowered himself into the chair was the way of someone who wasn't entirely certain their legs would hold. He put his hands on his thighs, pressed them flat, looked down at the desk, then up at me, then back down at the desk. I came because I need to speak with whoever handles compliance issues in the investment advisory space. He measured each word carefully, the way someone picks their way through a minefield. I was directed to Meridian and I thought. He didn't finish the sentence. Someone directed you to Meridian's director of compliance, I said. And Meridian's director of compliance is me. Yes. One word. Colorless. I watched him for a moment without speaking. I could see clearly what was happening inside his head. The machinery of recognition as the pieces fell into place, 1, then 2, then 3, and the full picture arriving not gradually but all at once in a single collapse. He'd come here expecting to meet a stranger. He'd come here, for whatever reason which I didn't yet fully know, to do something related to Apex. And instead he had found me, his sister-in-law, the person he had convinced the whole family to remove 4 days ago. Daniel, I said. Where do you work? He looked at me. In his eyes was a thin, desperate thread of hope. Hope that maybe I didn't know, that maybe this was harmless coincidence, that maybe he could still somehow regain control of the situation. Apex Advisory Partners, he said, barely audible. I let the silence stretch. This is a technique I learned from a veteran investigator in my first year on the job. Don't rush to fill the gap. Let the other person sit in the quiet and feel the weight of what's just been said. Do you know what investigation I'm currently leading? I asked at last. Daniel closed his eyes. A long pause. No, he said. But his voice said yes. Apex Advisory Partners. I said the name with the same calm I'd used to read a line from a document. We identified your company as a subject of investigation last week. Before Thanksgiving. I paused for just one beat. Before you convinced my family that it would be better for everyone if I wasn't at their table. Daniel opened his eyes. His face now was more than pale, it was collapsing the way a face collapses when the thing holding it together from the inside gives way. The reality was pouring in, and there was nothing left to stop it. Lena. He started to say something. You met me twice. I continued, still calm, because calm is a form of power in moments like this, not coldness. The first time I asked you about your work. Normal enough, we'd just been introduced, and I wanted to understand who you were. But afterward you replayed those questions and realized I hadn't been asking the way people ask at dinner parties. I was asking about fee structures, about the relationship between advisory firms and the funds they recommend, about disclosure practices with clients. I don't remember exactly. I do, I said. Then at the wedding, when Sophie introduced me more completely and you understood what compliance means, you got worried. Not vague worried. Specifically worried. Because you knew there was a problem inside your firm, and you didn't want me, someone whose profession is finding problems, having any more opportunities to observe you up close. Daniel said nothing. He didn't deny it. And that silence was heavier than any confession. So you chose the simplest solution, I went on. Remove me. Nothing complicated, just convince your wife, convince her family that I was difficult, that I would ruin the mood, that Thanksgiving would be better without me there. And you did exactly that. Lena, I know how this sounds. It doesn't sound like anything, I said. It's what happened. I looked directly at him. What you didn't account for is that we had identified Apex the week before. Before you called Sophie. Before you persuaded my family that my absence would make everything nicer. I want you to understand this clearly. Everything you did, all the hurt you caused, changed nothing. We already knew. There was nothing you could have prevented by keeping your distance from me. The silence that followed was different from ordinary silence. This wasn't the silence of someone thinking or searching for words. This was the silence of someone who has just set down something very heavy and doesn't know if they can remain standing without it. Daniel sat in front of me in that state, not quite still because every so often he opened his mouth as if about to speak and then stopped, not quite composed because the muscles along his jaw were visibly tight, for about 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes I didn't push. I just sat and waited. Outside the window, the city was going about its business. Faint car horns from far below. The hum of the hallway air system. Normal sounds continuing in a world that had no awareness of what was unraveling in this particular office. I didn't know you worked at Meridian specifically, he said finally. I only knew you worked in finance. Sophie mentioned compliance. But I didn't connect it to Meridian. But you connected it to Apex, I said. You were worried because you knew your firm was doing something wrong. He didn't deny that either. I wasn't the one who designed the fee structure. I was an advisor. I implemented what I was instructed from above. And you signed the advisory documents, I said. Your signature confirmed that those recommendations were made in the best interest of the client. He closed his eyes again. Daniel. I said his name, and this time there was something in my voice I didn't try to hide. Not anger, not satisfaction, just plain directness. I'm going to tell you something in my professional capacity, not as a family member. Your coming here today doesn't help you. The investigation is at a stage where we don't need additional information from individuals under review. We have the documentation to build the case. What happens next is a decision for the legal committee and the regulators, not for me. Could I? If I cooperated, if I provided more information about. That's a conversation you need to have with an attorney. Not with me. I looked at him steadily. And honestly, Daniel, you shouldn't say anything more to me right now. Anything said in this office could be relevant later. That was a warning I wasn't required to give him. But I gave it anyway, and I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because whatever he had done to me, Sophie was still my sister and she loved this man. He stood up. His legs looked unsteady in the way I've seen many times, the physical exhaustion of emotional collapse. At the door he stopped and turned back to look at me. I'm sorry, he said. About Thanksgiving. About what I told Sophie. About all of it. I looked at him for a moment, and I saw something behind the face of a man backed into a corner, behind the desperation and the fear, something that looked more genuine. Not quite remorse, remorse takes time to mature, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that he had caused real damage to real people, and no apology could make it fully disappear. Get a lawyer, Daniel, I said. Today. He nodded and left. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, the elevator opening and closing, then the ordinary quiet of a workday morning. I didn't stand up right after Daniel left. I stayed in my chair in the silence of that conversation's aftermath and let myself just sit. Priya looked in once, saw me staring out the window, and withdrew without a word. Something I was quietly grateful for, because she'd had the good judgment to read the room. Outside, the city was living its normal life. Pedestrians, traffic, a mobile coffee cart serving the people who'd come in late after the long holiday weekend. The sky still that pale November gray, promising nothing, threatening nothing. I thought about my family the morning before. My mother washing dishes left over from Thanksgiving dinner. I know she always washes them the next morning, never the night before, because she says leaving dirty dishes overnight is disrespectful to the house. My father sitting in his armchair watching football with his morning coffee. Marcus texting someone on his phone. Sophie sitting next to Daniel, her head resting on his shoulder the way people do in the first months of marriage, when the other person's proximity still feels like something to be grateful for. And Daniel sitting there, probably smiling, probably participating in the table conversation, and carrying what exactly inside himself? Momentary relief that Thanksgiving had passed quietly without me? Or the low, persistent hum of anxiety that never quite goes silent when you know something is being dug toward? The kind that sits behind everything, reminding you that what you're afraid of has nothing to do with who's sitting at which table? I thought about what my mother said. You would ruin the atmosphere. The atmosphere. They had protected the atmosphere of a family holiday by sacrificing my place in it. And the person they were protecting that atmosphere for, the person they didn't want me to disturb or make uncomfortable, that person was concealing something that would break far more than any atmosphere. Not just a dinner. Much more than that. The irony isn't that I was right and they were wrong. That kind of clean moral arithmetic isn't satisfying and it isn't warm. The irony runs deeper, is sadder than that. My family had looked at me and seen potential disruption, and had not looked at Daniel and seen the same. Not because he was better at hiding than I was at revealing, but because Daniel didn't challenge them. He didn't ask questions. He smiled and agreed and made everyone comfortable, and in my family, that is the thing that gets rewarded while the other thing gets punished. I opened my laptop and went back to work. That's what I do best when I don't know what to do with my emotions, work. I pulled up the Apex Advisory Partners investigation file and read through it from the beginning. 6 months of effort, thousands of documents, dozens of interviews, hundreds of hours of data analysis. And there, in the list of Apex financial advisors we'd cataloged, I found the name Daniel Brooks, Senior Financial Advisor. Signature on 23 advisory agreements we had flagged as problematic. I hadn't recognized the name before. Why would I? I don't have a habit of cross-referencing family information with professional investigations. That isn't just a professional ethics principle. It's mental hygiene. When you do work like mine, you need to keep those domains separate, or you start seeing suspicion everywhere even where it has no foundation. But now, looking at that name in the list, I felt something more complicated than any simple emotion. Not satisfaction. Not anger. A sadness with several layers for Sophie, for the clients who'd been misled. For the way truth tends to arrive poorly timed and leave wreckage along its path. In the weeks following that Monday morning, several things happened simultaneously, in the way life tends to arrange itself when it has no interest in asking whether you have the capacity. The Apex investigation report was finalized and filed on schedule that Friday. Meridian referred the case to the SEC and the Department of Justice the following week. The legal process began moving at its own pace. Slow, certain, unstoppable. Daniel hired an attorney, a good one, a specialist in securities law with a reputation for being effective. He cooperated with the investigation, providing information about decisions made above him in Apex's organizational structure. In his case, that cooperation might, only might, make a meaningful difference in the degree of consequences he ultimately faces. That is for his attorney and the justice system to determine, not me. Apex Advisory Partners closed its doors 3 months later. Several senior leaders faced criminal indictment. Most of the advisors, including Daniel, faced civil and regulatory sanctions. The affected clients, nearly 100 families, began the process of seeking recovery through legal channels. Among those clients was a couple in their early 60s who had invested a significant portion of their retirement savings on Apex's advice and had lost a substantial amount through the undisclosed fee structure. When I read their file during the documentation process, I remember sitting still for a moment with the particular heaviness this work sometimes brings. Not exhaustion or cynicism, but the necessary reminder that behind every number in a spreadsheet is an actual life. Sophie called me on a Tuesday evening about 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. I was at home, eating dinner alone and reading, when my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. I looked at it for 2 seconds before answering. Not hesitation exactly, but preparation. Lena. Her voice was hoarse and unsteady in the way of someone who hadn't cried for 10 minutes but for several days. Are you okay to talk? Yes, I said. I'm listening. She talked for nearly an hour. About everything she'd just learned. About the disorientation, not the dramatic film kind, but the slow, exhausted kind of someone who has to process a truth one piece at a time. About the question she said she kept asking herself. How could he not have told me? Which I knew Sophie would keep asking for a long time to come. About the formless fear about what would happen next. About what her life would look like now. About who she was going to be after all of this. I didn't say, Sophie, he also lied to you about Thanksgiving. Not because it hadn't occurred to me, but because Sophie on that phone call didn't need any more information. She needed to be heard. So I listened. At the end of the call, Sophie said, I'm sorry. About Thanksgiving. I should have. Don't, I said. Not tonight. Take care of yourself first. A short silence. Then, thank you. My mother called me the week after that. That conversation was harder. With Sophie, there was a truth that was simple if agonizing. She had been deceived by someone she loved. With my mother, the truth was more layered, demanded that she look at things about herself she wasn't practiced at examining. She didn't apologize directly, she isn't good at that, and I don't think I can change it in a single conversation. But she said, in a voice that sounded rougher than usual, I didn't ask you about any of it. I should have asked you first. For my mother, that was a significant step. She didn't say I was wrong because I'm not sure she has the vocabulary for that yet. But she was acknowledging a specific failure, and I was wise enough to recognize that as a beginning. I know, Mom, I said. Are you angry with me? I considered the question genuinely for a moment. Yes. But not the kind of angry I want to carry forever. She was quiet. Then, you say things like that. Sentences I have to think about for a long time before I understand them. That's because I ask too many questions and overthink everything, Mom. I didn't say that bitterly. I said it in the voice of someone who has learned to find the humor in her own wounds. It's just how I am. My mother went quiet for just a beat. Then she, rarely enough that I couldn't be certain I'd heard it before, gave a small laugh. Marcus called me at the end of December. Not a long call. He's not built for long calls. Lena, he said. I should have been in your corner back then. 7 words. No further explanation. No reasons given. No justification offered. For Marcus, that was the longest speech he'd ever delivered to me. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I know that too. We sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable silence of 2 siblings who don't need to fill every space with words. Are you bringing anything for Christmas? He asked finally. Not sure. I was thinking tiramisu. Don't. Your baking is terrible. Wine then. Much better idea. I'm telling this story in October. 1 year after everything I've just described. Next week is Thanksgiving. My mother called 3 days ago to ask if I was coming. Not in the careful, diplomatic voice of someone navigating a delicate negotiation. In her ordinary voice, the voice she uses when she's planning a meal and needs to know how many people to cook for. Pumpkin pie, I told her. I'll make it myself. And this time the crust won't burn because I've practiced. She laughed. I laughed too. This isn't a return to normal. We aren't a family that has found perfect equilibrium or resolved every old problem. There are still conversations that haven't been had, things being rebuilt piece by piece. But it is a genuine beginning, not a pretense of starting from zero, but starting from exactly where we actually stand with full awareness of what happened. Sophie and Daniel are going through a divorce. My sister doesn't talk about it much, and I don't ask if she doesn't want to share. What I see is that she's doing better each month. Not in the sense that the pain has disappeared, because pain like that doesn't disappear quickly, but in the sense that she's finding herself again, remembering who she was before Daniel, and discovering that the woman she remembers is stronger and more whole than she'd been giving herself credit for. I still see my therapist every 2 weeks. That's not something I mention to many people, not out of embarrassment but because I don't feel the need to announce it. If someone asks, though, I'll say it helps. Having someone who isn't part of my family and isn't part of my work sit across from me and ask questions about me, on the days when I'm normally the one asking questions about everyone else, is something I didn't know I needed until I had it. There are still nights when I lie awake thinking about that Monday morning. Not to analyze what happened or find the thing I should have said or not said differently, but because some moments fix themselves into memory in a particular way. Not because they're perfect or heroic, but because they hold something unfiltered, unpolished, genuinely true. Daniel's face when he walked in and saw me. The moment he looked at my nameplate and understood. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't victory. It was the feeling of truth settling into its correct place, in a way that couldn't be undone, couldn't be hidden, couldn't be disguised any further. He had pushed me out of my family's table because he was afraid of me. And what he hadn't understood was that it didn't matter whether I was sitting at that table or not. Truth doesn't need a chair to exist. In my career, I've learned something I believe applies not only to finance but to most of what matters. Concealment has a cost. The cost isn't always collected immediately, and the people who pay it aren't always the people who made the choice to conceal. Sometimes the people who had nothing to do with the decision to hide something are the ones who suffer first and most. Daniel concealed to protect himself. But the cost of that concealment was charged to Sophie, who loved him and wasn't given the truth, to Apex's clients, who trusted the firm with their savings, to me, who was removed from my family's table for a reason no one was willing to name honestly, and perhaps most of all to Daniel himself, because every day lived inside a concealment is a day not lived honestly, and the price of that isn't only the legal consequences when the truth eventually surfaces. I'm not saying this to moralize. I'm saying it because it's what I see over and over in my work and in my life, and I don't know how to look at it without recognizing it for what it is. Next week I'm going home for Thanksgiving. I'll bring pumpkin pie. The crust won't burn this time because I've made it twice in practice and written down each step. I'll sit down at the familiar oak table. I'll drink red wine with my father and talk about football even though I don't care about football. I'll help my mother clear the dishes after the meal. I'll sit beside Sophie and won't ask about Daniel, because she'll tell me when she's ready. My family is not perfect. My family is not at the point where I feel that everything has been resolved and I no longer need to be careful about anything. But my family is trying, in the way people try, slowly, unevenly, 2 steps forward and 1 back, but continuing. And I'm trying to forgive not because they deserve it or because I owe it to anyone, but because I need it to keep moving forward, to not carry that weight inside me indefinitely. That's not surrender and it's not weakness. It's the deliberate choice of someone who understands that anger and hurt can be necessary companions for a time, but they make terrible permanent residents. My name is Lena Carter. I'm 26 years old. I'm a director of compliance. I ask too many questions, I analyze everything, I occasionally make people uncomfortable, and I have not learned. And honestly, I'm not certain I want to learn how to stop noticing when things don't add up. Last year, those same qualities helped bring to light a financial fraud scheme that affected nearly 100 families. Last year, those same qualities got me uninvited from my own family's Thanksgiving table. Both of those things are true. At the same time, I'm not telling this story to prove I was right or to make anyone feel guilty. I'm telling it because for many years I believed that the parts of me other people found uncomfortable were the parts one needed to suppress, manage, make smaller. And then one day I understood that those parts, the parts that ask, that notice, that won't sit quietly when something is wrong, those aren't flaws. That's me. And the world sometimes needs people like that. Not to make everyone uncomfortable, but to see the things other people are looking past. Don't let anyone convince you that the part of you that questions, that pays attention, that refuses to stop when you're told to, don't let anyone convince you that part is a nuisance that needs to be silenced. No matter who that person is, no matter which end of the table they sit at, because sometimes precisely that part is the most necessary thing there is. And if there's ever a morning when you find yourself sitting alone on a holiday, looking out at an empty street, feeling like you're standing outside a locked door while everyone inside is warm and gathered together. Remember this. Sometimes that door isn't locked to keep you out. Sometimes it's locked to keep a secret in. And a secret, no matter how carefully it's kept, cannot last forever. The truth doesn't need you to be in the room to find its way out. It only needs time.